In this video, we'll be discussing reading data files into SPSS from a variety of different data storage formats, including previously saved SPSS data files, Excel data files, and CSV data files, which are, if you're not familiar with them, comma-separated value files, and that is a commonly used file format for statistical analysis programs. We're also going to discuss reading a code book and getting information from it, and how to enter that information into SPSS, which will use some of the skills that we practiced in the previous video. So let's get started by opening SPSS. Now in this first menu, I want to be careful because it feels like we should go to a new data set to open SPSS. But this menu is one that I typically X out of. And instead, to open a new data file, I go to File and then Open. And then I select Data to open a new data file. I'll navigate to where on my computer I have my data files stored. In my case, it is the desktop. And then I'll select the file that I'm interested in. Now, if you remember from a moment ago, on my desktop, I had a variety of different data files on there, and right now I'm only seeing one SAV file. And this is SPSS's default opening data view, is that it only looks for files of type SPSS. And so I'm only going to see SPSS data files which end in .sav. To see all of the other ones, I can go down and select the specific file that I'm looking for. So for Excel, I could select the Excel files of type, and then I can see my Excel file. I could select the CSV files of type, and I could see my CSV file. Or I can scroll all the way to the bottom and select all files, and then I can see all of the files that I currently have within that particular folder or directory. I'm going to start by reading in the SPSS data file because it's probably our cleanest and nicest one. I simply select the file and I click Open, and you can see that my dataset is now open on my computer. I have a variety of different questions. These that we're working with today come from the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale, which is a 10-item scale, at least in the format that we're using. Additionally, we have gender, age, and source and country as demographic information. You'll note that the symbols next to each of these variables represent different things, and if I click into the variable view, you'll see that labels, values, and previous levels of measurement have already been entered and have been saved. This is clearly a great benefit of importing SPSS files into SPSS, is that all of the variable metadata that could have been entered by someone else can copy over with those data files. And this is not something that happens with Excel data files or CSV data files. But again, it's a very, very handy thing if I'm working with somebody or collaborating with somebody who is using SPSS, or I'm downloading a data file from a government website, that I can download this information in a format where the variable view has already been filled out and I don't have to go in and manually enter this information. Again, a very handy thing, and pretty simple to open our SPSS data file. All right, well that's how we open an SPSS data file. How then do I go about opening a different data file, such as the Excel or the CSV data file? Well, I'm going to do the similar steps of going to File, Open, and Data, and we already showed you earlier how that you can see the different types of data. So I'm going to go to All Files so I can see all of my data, and I'm going to select the rse_data.xlsx file to open the Excel file. I'll select Open to run the Open command, and you'll see a different menu pops up. In fact, previously, there was no menu for reading in an SPSS data file because all of the options that you have to select have already been fixed as you're reading in an SPSS file. Here, though, to read in an Excel file, I have a few options that I can go through. We're going to have a lot of potential options when reading in Excel files and CSV files, and I'm not going to discuss all of them here, but I do encourage you to take some time to read through the options that are available, as well as your textbook and the SPSS documentation if you would like to explore these further. Once I've selected the options that I'm comfortable with, I click OK to read in my data file. What you'll notice with this new data file is that my variables, Q1 through Q10, all have a different symbol next to them, and when I go into variable view, there are no labels, no values are given, no missing data possibilities, and all of my measures are considered nominal, except for age, which is considered at a scale level. So again, this has imported the data appropriately, and this is going to be typically what we get when we're importing data into SPSS. Typically, we don't have an SPSS data file already created with all the variable attributes nicely listed. So instead, we end up having to read through them and enter them. All right, let's talk about our final data set, the CSV data set. And I saved this one for last because it has even more options. I'm going to go to Files of type CSV. I'll select my CSV file and I'll click Open. I also saved CSV for last because I think that CSV is probably the most common data format that I see. And the reason CSV is really nice is because a lot of different programs read CSV files. So for instance, you can open a CSV file within Excel if you would like. You can also open a CSV file in SPSS or in R or in Python. There's a variety of different places that you can do it. Some different softwares that may not accept a file type in Excel or a SPSS file type, which very few softwares accept, may accept a CSV file type, so it's very transferable. It also doesn't take up a lot of space. All right, so I can select how my variables are arranged. I'll be 100% honest with y'all. I tend to just click Next for these first couple options. The first place that I personally start to pay attention is on step 4, where I really want to look at the data preview and make sure that my data are looking like they should when I'm reading them in. So I see Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 are all different columns, gender, age, source, country. All looks like it's reading in appropriately. I just have a few variables that's listed on here. So everything looks correct to me, and that's a good indication that whatever these options were, they are correct. But again, just as with the Excel data file, I encourage you to go in, check out the options if you're interested in them, and take some time to explore those. And I think you'll see that the default options make a lot of sense typically. Again, this step 4 of the CSV import, typically the delimiters up here can actually, typically they're selected pretty well in SPSS by default, but sometimes you may have to tweak them depending on how your data look in the data preview. As my data look fine, I'm going to click Next, and then Finish, and that will import my CSV file. Incidentally, for my CSV import, you'll notice that I have my first output. And all that this output is doing, and I see output in the top left, that's the file name for an output that hasn't been saved, and you see SPSS Statistics Viewer as opposed to the top data editor where we have our data. So this is a different type of file that we have open here. This is our statistics file, which we'll explore more later in the class. And right now, all I'm seeing in this output is the variables that have been read in, and some decisions that SPSS made when reading in those variables. So I'm just going to go ahead and X out of this comfortably, knowing that this output doesn't provide me any information that I haven't already seen, as I personally entered in all of the details for how I wanted the variables to be read in. You'll notice that in the data editor, I can quickly glance at the types of variables. I can see how the variables are displayed on here, and in the variable view, just like with Excel, I'm not going to have any of those labels or value information available. So I've read in 3 data sets. Now it's time to explore a little bit more, and I'm going to go into my data sets and I'm going to X out of the previous 2, focusing instead on the 3rd data set that I read in, this CSV file. And this is going to be a tutorial for how we can get information on our variables and enter it into SPSS that very easily applies not just to CSV, but to Excel files and really to any other data file that SPSS can read in that is not an SPSS file with variable details already entered. So the question that arises at this stage is, how do I find information regarding these variables that connect back to the information that I can enter into SPSS? And the answer is ultimately something called a codebook. So I'm going to minimize SPSS and go back to my desktop so that we can explore what typically happens when you get data from online. So if I download, say, a national data set, I might get two types of files that come with it. I might get my data, but then I might get some documentation. One type of documentation is a layout file, and the layout file provides some information that allows me to see how and where the data are stored. So in this particular layout file, it gives me the data set name, it gives me how many total records are in the data set, and then it gives me a listing of variable names, locations, and descriptions. So for instance, the first variable is student ID. The location is 1 through 7. This indicates columns 1 through 7. And then the description is that this is the student ID. The second variable, and I should say the variable name, this is F2UNIV1, is located in columns 8 through 11. And I say columns, those are how many characters have been typed in. So the characters 8 through 11 represent F2UNIV1. And what this is the sample member status in by F1 and F2. And you'll see that there's a lot of variables in this data set. And in fact, in government data sets, there tend to be a lot of variables that are available. So it is very important to be able to navigate to the type of variables that you're interested in within these data sets. And it's important to be able to see the type of information that's discussed within these data sets so that you don't just try to open the data and try to read through this, because frankly, the information in the data would be very, very difficult to navigate. So as part of reading through that, we can see in this BYS20, this is columns 51 and 52, the language that the student usually speaks now. And in this particular case, language student usually speaks now, I might be interested in learning, well, if I open this data set, there's the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What do those numbers stand for? So even with this information given in the layout's focus is typically where the variables are located and less what the numbers, which are often listed in government data sets and large-scale data sets, actually mean. So to interpret what the numbers mean, and again in BYS20, if I write in a data file for this variable, I'm going to see numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What I need to do is investigate how this variable was coded. The information on how a variable was coded is listed in a document called a code book. And these code books are provided with data sets that you procure online. I don't want to say typically or always or anything like that. Some data sets don't have them. But when you're creating a data set that you intend for others to use and be informed about what is going on within the data, it is expected that you provide a code book with your data set. So for this code book, I can see that the data that I'm studying is NELS, stands for National Education Longitudinal Study. This is an older study. There are more updated versions of this study that you can access if you want to. This is just one I have on my computer for us to explore in this class. And what I want to do in this code book, if I scroll down, I can see that I have a name included, a position, a length, the label or description, and then I have more in-depth descriptions, and a listing of what each of the responses could be. So I could see a 0003, which would represent bi-I, F1-A, F2-DO, and I can quickly see, as is occasionally but not always provided in Codebooks, that there are 32 respondents that fall within this category. I was going to look at the variable I found previously, so I'm going to do Control and F at the same time. This opens a Find menu within my program. If you open a TXT codebook, it's likely going to appear in Notepad or something, and you should be able to use a find command, though your options may not look exactly like mine. I'm going to copy in the variable name, and I'm going to find where it occurs. So I've been taken to where the variable name is. I can see this is the variable. It's in that position 51. It's 2 characters long, language that the respondent usually speaks at home. And I can see actually in this codebook a listing of the question and each of the numbers that I would see in the data, 01, 02, 03, 04. And I can then go and see what the language is that that number is referring to. So for instance, if I saw 04 in the data, I could go and see that the language that's being spoken by the respondent is, in this particular case, Japanese, for a respondent who had 04 listed there. Other information that's often provided in a codebook are things like missing or multiple response, or in this particular case, a dot also represents missing, but a different kind of missing. This dot represents a missingness where the individual was not within the sample. So it was a methodological missing, not that the individual chose not to answer the question. All right, well, this is complex, and again, tends to be what we see in national level code books. I pull this up so that you can have seen this and kind of not be too afraid of it if you're asked to look at one of these later. But these code books are, frankly, rather extensive. If pulling a subset of variables, you can just pull subsets of your code book so that you don't have to look at the whole thing. So if I'm just pulling 3 or 4 different variables, I might pull just 3 or 4 different sections of this code book, copy and paste them into a different document so that I don't have to dig through this whole file. Of course, this whole file, if I scroll down, is several 100,000 lines long and includes, again, documentation on many, many, many variables that I may not be using. So if I'm using this, let's see, we're 205,309 values long, not just for the data set. This is just for the description of the data set, the code book. All right, so that's been code books. Let's talk about how to use a code book. That is, how do I take an example code book? And we're not going to start with the National Education Longitudinal Survey. We'll start with our Rosenberg self-esteem scale. We just have 10 items, gender, age, source, and country, and we'd like to be able to code these appropriately within SPSS. Well, I'm going to open the codebook that was obtained when I obtained the dataset. It gives some information about the scale that we obtained. It gives some information about the data and consent, as well as data quality. And then finally, it gives a listing of the questions for each of these questions and the scale that each of these were rated on. And so I'm going to use this information to start to fill out my variable attributes within SPSS. The first thing that I'm going to do is for each of these variables, I don't particularly understand what Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4 mean, so I'm going to go in and add a label within each of these. You're welcome to pause this video and work ahead of me if you're working along, but all I'm going to do is simply copy and paste for Q1, the question 1, which is, I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on an equal plane with others. I'm going to copy it from my codebook and go and paste it into the label for the first question. And I'm going to repeat this process for each one of these questions so that I have all of my questions with labels where I can actually read the values in them. Now, I'll speak while I'm doing this. One thing that I could do that I will not do is I could then go and change the labels of the variables. Now that I actually know what is Q8, Q8 is, I wish I could have more respect for myself. I could go and instead of having this be Q8, I could change this to something like self-respect. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to leave this as Q8, but that is an option that I could do if I wanted to. As you play around in SPSS and play around with things like variable names, you'll notice that there are some variable names that are allowed and some variable names that aren't allowed. There's a few somewhat technical rules on that. I'm not going to get into those rules, but do be aware that if I tried to type in something like, in this one, I certainly feel useless at times, I feel useless, that I may not be able to make that variable. So I encourage you to continue checking out the other resources in this class to get a feel for what those variable names are that are allowed. And a good rule of thumb is just to not put spaces in them. So if I wanted to name that variable name something that long, I could write I underscore feel underscore useless, and that would be allowed. It's not the point of this video, but as I'm typing this stuff in, I figured I'd mention it. So for gender, I'll just mention in detail that I choose from a drop-down list. Now it does give me the options, and I am going to enter the options, but I don't need to enter the options in the label, because remember, I have a whole section in the SPSS variable attribute where I can enter the values, and so I'll do that next. Age was entered as a free response. Source, how did they came to the page, and for HTTP refer, I may or may not know what that means. My goal right now is to just copy and paste the information that I'm provided in my codebook. And this is all the information I have about these variables. I don't know any more about these variables than you do. This is all of the information that I have. But I want to make sure that all this information is stored where I'm actually storing my data. So if I'm storing my data to do the analysis in SPSS, I want to make sure that all of this information is stored in SPSS. So that as I'm analyzing, I can always quickly go back and determine which of my variables is which particular question, etc. All right, well, I've just finished typing in the labels. Now it's time to continue with entering each variable's values. So I'm going to go to question 1 and try to figure out, if I look at my data, I see question 1 has values of 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I need to figure out what do those values actually mean so that I can enter them into the values and again be able to interpret them in SPSS without having to refer back to my data documentation. That is, I'm entering my data documentation where I'm storing and eventually analyzing my data. In my codebook, and this is a little bit different in this codebook than it would be in a national codebook. In a national level codebook, each item would have these listed separately for each item. So each item has its own documentation. But in codebooks that are maybe for data sets that aren't quite as big or aren't quite as used or aren't quite as well known, or if you have pulled information from, say, a published journal article, oftentimes you'll see something like this, where you see all of the following items had this scale, or all of the following items were rated on a Likert scale, or something like that. And in that particular case, then you know for each of these, questions 1 through 10, 1 represents strongly disagree, 2 represents disagree, 3 represents agree, 4 represents strongly agree, and 0 represents no answer or a missing value. So for me, for question 1, I'm going to go in and just copy that information over. 1 represents strongly disagree. 2 represents disagree. 3 represents agree. 4 represents strongly agree. Now, we've discussed this in a previous video in this class. What we haven't discussed is I have to do this for each one of the variables. Is there an easier way as opposed to having to retype that information every time? And the answer is absolutely. In SPSS, if you want to copy attributes, I can right-click on the attribute and select Copy, and then I can go to the attribute that I want to paste it into, right-click and select Paste to paste that value. I can also use the Control-C and Control-V hotkeys on my computer so that I can paste these relatively quickly. Now I've entered the values, but if you remember in my codebook, I'm actually missing one of the values. That is, I had a 0 representing no answer or missing. Don't forget, in our variable view, we have another attribute where we can declare missing. And for questions 1 through 10, I'm going to declare a value of 0 to be missing. Some codebooks in, say, a government dataset might declare all values above 99 to be missing. So maybe there are multiple missing values. I could either enter those if they're provided separately, individually, or I can select a range of values to account for all of them. In this particular case, I'm going to select 0 as the only missing value because within my codebook, that's the only value that's marked as missing. And again, I'll use my Control-C and Control-V trick to copy and paste this variable attribute multiple times into other variables. For gender, I haven't yet typed in my values or my missing, so I'll go down to my codebook. I'll find gender. 1 represents male, 3 represents female, and 3 represents other. I believe this is a typo in my codebook. I apologize. 2 represents female. Let me just real quick make sure I have 2s in my data set, and I do. I have lots of 1s, lots of 2s. So clearly a typo, 1 representing male, 2 representing female, and 3 representing other. And then 0 represents none was chosen or missing. So I'm going to go into my gender. 1 represents male, 2 represents female, 3 represents other. And again, instead of entering missing in my values, I'm going to go to the missing column and mark 0 as my missing value. You might wonder why the 0 as a missing value matters as opposed to 0 as a value. And ultimately, the reason it matters is because when you're accounting for gender, you may want a report to come out on the males and females and other, but you may not want a report to come out on your missing values. Similarly, with my Likert type scales, 1 strongly disagree to 4 strongly agree, I might want to calculate an average agreement on this particular scale. But 0 wouldn't be an appropriate value to include in that average. That would represent something further along the disagree line than strongly disagree if I interpreted 0 as a number or an average on that scale. Whereas within this context, I've been told 0 simply means that the participant did not respond. Looking at these, I have age entered as a free response. So age is not going to have any potential coding, but 0 represents a response that could not be converted into an integer, either a blank response or a response that wasn't a number. So 0 still represents missing for age, and I'm going to go in and add that 0 is missing. For source, how the user came to the page, 1 represents the front page of a personality test website, 2 represents a Google search, and 3 represents other. So I'm going to go in and enter this information. 1 front page, 2 represents a Google search, 3 represents other. And actually, I should probably update this to include the full listing in the codebook. That is the front page of the personality test website. So I'll simply copy and paste this from the codebook and change that particular value to be updated. Finally, for the country, I look at the country. This is inferred from technical information, but I notice that the country variable is already a string. And if I look at my data value, I can see that unlike source or gender, where a number was used to represent a category, within country, the actual category itself is listed as a text string. So I don't have numbers representing the United States or Canada. I actually have the listing of the country out. All right. Well, let's close this lecture video on data entry and reading in data in SPSS out by discussing the measure. This is the last thing we would have to take care of in this particular data entry, is I'd want to go and list each of these measures as ordinal. Again, I can copy and paste for my data, so I'm going to go and copy and paste this down. And ordinal is representing each of my 1 through 10. That is, these are all in order, but not necessarily numerically equivalent. That is, disagree. Moving from strongly disagree to disagree is not necessarily the same thing as moving from disagree to agree. A movement of 1 doesn't necessarily represent the same thing everywhere, and that's the definition of our ordinal data. Gender, I'm going to leave as nominal. Age, I'm going to leave as scale. And source and country, I'm also going to leave as nominal. So I've updated the measurement here. And that closes out my adding in variable attributes from a code book for a data set that I've read in from a CSV file. In this video, we've talked about how to read in data files from a variety of different file formats, including the SPSS default format, a .sav file, which reads in with all of the data, as well as all of the variable attributes that have been entered by the person who has saved the data set. We also talked about how to read in Excel files and how to read in CSV files. We discussed how to look at and read codebooks, as well as how to use the codebook information to update variable attributes within SPSS.